Hi everyone, Mike here from Bikes by Mike with another cycling related video. So I'm back in the garage to talk to you about shocks. I have my 2019 Cannondale Scalpel Si mounted onto a repair stand so I can show you how the remote lockout works on this bike and why I'm changing it over from a push to unlock format to push to lock. Okay, let's get to it. So first, I'm not a suspension expert, so I'm not doing this conversion myself, but the guys and gals at Suspension Works are, so they're going to handle it. And if this is something you're contemplating doing yourself, I'm not saying don't try it, but I think it's safe to say that this is probably the most advanced bike maintenance task you can take on yourself. And if you're not deterred, consider this, that for your average shop mechanic, they're not going to take this on. They're going to disassemble the shocks, ship it off to Suspension Works or a few of the other really competent and specialized suspension maintenance companies out there to do the servicing. So it's not something you can easily do yourself. And quite frankly, even if you can do it yourself, are you going to be able to do it as well and tune up your suspension as well as the experts? My feeling is, in talking to professional bike mechanics, is that it's not something you want to take on yourself. Send it off to the experts, get it done right. Okay, so in terms of the shock setup on this bike, at the front I have the Cannondale Scalpel Lefty carbon fork, and at the rear this is the Fox Float DPS rear shock. And I'm pretty certain that both are the 2019 version. That's paired with the Fox 2-position remote, which is the 2-cable setup. So just a bit in terms of how the remote works. It's quite simple. You have 2 cables, one that goes to the front fork, one that's fished through to the rear shock, and these buttons are currently off or released. So the shocks, both shocks are in the closed position. So these are in the locked out position. So there's no cable tension on either the front fork or the rear shock right now. If I push this button, it adds tension to the cable, and now both shocks are in the open position or activated position. And that's of course the position that most riders, even if you use a remote lockout a lot, you're going to be riding in this position at least 90% of the time. So again, in is cable tension on, which opens up the shocks or makes them active. Pushing the top button at the top releases the big one, and now there's no cable tension and both shocks are locked out. So again, push in, activate the shocks, small button, release. So this is a 2019 Cannondale Scalpel Si, and for this remote lockout setup, the default when there's no cable tension is for both shocks to be locked out. So it's considered as what's referred to as the push to unlock format. You have to push the remote, add cable tension to unlock the shocks. So 2019, I think for 2020, certainly for 2021 onwards, this was reversed to push to lock. So the default, when there's no cable tension like this, is that the shocks are fully flowing. They're open and they're activated. So you have to actually put cable tension on to lock out the fork. That is by far, in my opinion, the better format. And since they're now using that as the default, I suspect most riders prefer that as well. So I basically have 3 major issues with this remote setup with the push to unlock for the default. So the first is that regardless of how much you use a remote, for most riders, you're going to spend the vast majority of your time with the shocks fully activated, with them open and not locked out. So it just makes sense to me that the remote should reflect that, and the default should be for the shocks to be in the unlocked position. The second thing is that I fiddled around with the placement of this remote kind of more towards the stem of the bike and more towards the grips. up and down, everything. And I just find no matter where I put it, I find that when I'm riding, at some point I'll accidentally hit the button and put the shocks in the locked out position with no cable tension. It just seems to happen all the time regardless of what I do. And of course I'll be riding a bit not knowing that my shocks are locked out and then having to push the remote. So I just don't like it for that reason, that it's just easy to accidentally hit the remote and fully lock out the shocks. But the biggest reason why I want to do the conversion from push to unlock to push to lock is what happened to me recently in this year's 8-hour mountain bike race that I did solo. And because I did it solo, I was riding for 8 hours and I had this lockout malfunction on my first lap. So I did my own kind of bike maintenance hack midway through the race, and I got it working for a while and then it wasn't working. So of the 12 laps I did, I think I did 8 laps with both the front fork and the rear shock fully locked out, which is horrible. And I never want that to happen again. So I'm not going to put myself in a position where a remote could do that to me. And basically the issue is that with this setup of having to add cable tension to activate the shocks, it's a cable setup, it's a cable remote. So you're going to have the same issues you have wherever you have cables on a bike. If you use cable actuated brakes, cable actuated shifters, you know this already, that cables over time stretch. So of course, with this being a push to unlock format, where I have to add cable tension to unlock it, as the cables stretch, you get to a point, at some point where you're riding, where because the cables have stretched, you can't put enough tension by activating that remote button to release the shocks. And that's exactly what happened during the race. It was working fine pre-race when I was testing it out and pre-riding the course. But at some point, the cables just stretched enough that in pushing the button on the remote, I couldn't add enough cable tension to activate the locks. And yes, you can use barrel adjusters. Unfortunately for me, my barrel adjustments were maxed out, so there wasn't an easy fix to add cable tension to get the remote working properly. Yes, if I maintained my remote a bit better, I could have avoided this issue, but the best way to avoid this issue is not have the default where you have to add cable tension to release or open the shocks and have them active. That would solve all of the issues. So those are the 3 reasons why I really don't like this setup. I guess if I were to add a 4th reason is I just don't like remote lockouts. So it just clutters up the cockpit. I almost never use a lockout anyway. So I just like to remove the lockout entirely. And that's what I've wanted to do from the day I bought the bike, was just remove the remote lockout. But with the default being a push to unlock format for the remote, where I have to add cable tension to release, open, unlock the shocks, I can't remove the remote. Otherwise, my shocks are going to be fully locked out. So that's really why, all the reasons why I'm making the conversion from a push to unlock format on the remote to push to lock. So I'll have the shocks converted to that, and then when they're converted to that format, I can then, if I want, and I do, I'm just going to remove the remote lockout. So I know that a lot of riders really aren't going to care about this. Maybe they prefer the push to unlock format, or they just don't have a preference. But I've kind of looked online, read a lot of blogs, and a lot of riders are in the same situation I'm in, that they just really don't like this setup. They want it either to be a push to lock format, or many people like me just want to remove the lockout entirely. And to do that, of course, you need to have your fork and rear shock set up so that it's push to lock, not push to unlock. So I wish I knew that this could be done, this conversion could be done years ago, because I would have done it the day one that I got the bike. It really wasn't until I was sending off my fork and rear shock to Suspension Works for a regular annual 100-hour servicing that I asked them the question if it could be done. And they looked into it, and sure enough, they said, yeah, we can do it. We just need to replace a few parts in both the fork and the rear shock, and we can reverse the setup you have right now with the remote. So that's what I'm going to do. In the off season, I would normally send off my rear shock and fork to suspension work for servicing. So I'll get those rebuilt, and at the same time, I'll have them do the conversion to push to lock format for the remote. I know for a lot of you out there, this won't apply to you, or you won't care to make this conversion, but I'm sure there's at least one person out there like me that'll be glad to hear that you can choose whether your remote is a push to lock or push to unlock format. So that means I get at least one thumbs up and one view. Not bad. Nice. That's all I got for today, folks. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you're not a subscriber to this channel, please subscribe, as it allows me to produce more content for all of you. See you next time. Happy rolling.